Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony. I think these are really important hearings. I want to commend the Chairman for undertaking this important look at the future, what we need to do. Dr. O'Hanlon, I really appreciate your comments on Task Force Smith. You know, one of my favorite books that I have in my office, I actually suggested to the Secretary of Defense and his team to read, is T.R. Fehrenbach's This Kind of War, which I think for people thinking about readiness, it's always a good book to read on the lack of readiness that we had in the Korean War. And as Senator Inhofe mentioned, we seem to get it wrong every time, if you're looking historically. So I do want to amplify for the record on your comments on the Marine Corps. You mentioned effectiveness on Capitol Hill, effectiveness with the American people. You forgot to mention effectiveness on the battlefield. And as you can imagine, those levels of effectiveness are all related. But I want to talk about the size of the Army, and I know that you've written a lot. I really appreciate your Wall Street Journal op-ed recently on that. And with all due respect to Admiral Roughead, I think the idea of an Army of less than 300,000 is strategic lunacy. And hopefully nobody seriously is contemplating that. I certainly am not. I think it should be about double that size. General Milley, the Chief of Staff of the Army, gave a recent speech at the AUSA conference a couple of weeks ago that I thought was an excellent speech that talked about some of the myths of warfare. And one of those myths that he talked about was that armies are easy to regenerate. If you overshoot, cut to 300,000, and then, oh my gosh, we got a crisis, that you can, presto, bring back a couple brigade combat teams and, you know, units that need to be trained. Can any of you talk about just what that takes in terms of once you cut, once you get rid of a, you know, BCT, an airborne BCT, for example, what happens? How long does that take? Because obviously he thinks, he puts that out as a myth that it can take years, decades.
I could start, and I know others will want to weigh in. Thank you, Senator. General Deptula already made the very important point that it takes 20 years to grow a leader of a certain stature.
Right.
And you can try to distribute the existing stock across a slightly larger force structure and promote people a little faster and do a few things around the edges. And I would defer to those who have had more experience hands-on than I have. But I would simply note that the buildup of the last 15 years, once we started growing the force after 9/11, we grew by about 15% over about 6 to 8 years. And I think that's about as fast as I feel that we can empirically say is consistent with maintaining high standards. So I think 15% growth in overall numbers of people, of brigade combat teams, and so forth over a 6 to 8 year period, that's a pretty good set of numbers to keep in mind. Anything faster than that would be unproven, except going back to World War II when we had a much different kind of buildup. And I think, with all great respect to our World War II veterans, you know, some of the concepts in that particular fight were a little different than today's.
Sir.
Senator, I think General Milley was attacking a straw man in that speech. No thoughtful defense analyst thinks it's easy to grow an army. The question ultimately is it easier to grow an army or easier to grow a Navy or easier to grow an Air Force? And the capital-intensive services where you have to put investment in year after year in order to maintain a certain size, it winds up being easier to grow the Army. I think we surged up 80,000 people in the Army in a relatively short time, and a good number of those saw combat. It would be very difficult to imagine a Navy growing that fast in that amount of time.
Thank you. Let me switch topics a little bit here. The other thing that General Milley, and I know that our committee has been focused on, we try to do a fair amount in the NDAA this year on it, is focusing on the tooth-to-tail ratio with regard to if we have to make cuts. And again, I'm focused more back on the Army, but I'd appreciate your views on this more generally, that the last units we should be cutting are the units that are the, direct combat units. And do you think that as we're looking right now on kind of downsizing in the Army or the other branches, that we're getting that tooth-to-tail ratio correct? Or, because I certainly think that the last units we should be cutting are the BCTs and the other ground combat units. But Are we missing something in terms of getting that ratio correct? Dr. O'Hanlon?
Senator, I'll begin. I don't disagree with you, but I also think that one of the great strengths of the American military is that tail. Now, there are parts of it that are less efficient, and I would agree with the idea of putting 10, 20, 30% cuts into some of the headquarters and staff, and then letting the services and other organizations within DoD figure out how to make that happen. So I support that because I think there is a lot of waste. But the general notion of tail includes intelligence, includes logistics, transportation, cyber. All these things are crucial to how we fight, and I think our tail is actually just as impressive as our tooth in terms of how we stack up against other countries' militaries, which is part of why I'm just generally reluctant to get too far into that conversation, because it implies that if you really have tough budget caps, you can cut tail safely or relatively safely. I think we've just cut the defense budget enough, and we're going to have to recognize that the tail is important to protect in some cases as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.